There's a moment, usually not obvious when it's happening, where empathy stops being a natural trait and starts becoming a survival strategy. And if you look closely at the trauma-born empath, you'll see that their sensitivity wasn't something they simply had. It was something they had to develop. When a person grows up in an unpredictable emotional environment where moods shift quickly, where approval is inconsistent, where safety depends on reading subtle cues, they begin to study people at a level most never need to. Tone of voice, facial expressions, silence, micro changes in behavior, these aren't just noticed, they're analyzed, because getting it wrong had consequences. So the child adapts, they learn to anticipate, they learn to feel what others are feeling before it's even expressed. Not because it's a gift in the beginning, but because it's protection. This is where empathy is forged under pressure. But here's the part most people misunderstand. That same ability that allows them to connect deeply with others also wires them to associate connection with risk. Because early on, closeness wasn't stable. It wasn't safe. It came with confusion, emotional volatility, or even pain. So now you have someone who can read people better than almost anyone in the room but doesn't fully trust what they're reading. Or more accurately, doesn't trust what will happen next. And that creates a very specific kind of internal conflict. On one side, there's this deep capacity, understanding, compassion, and emotional awareness. On the other side, there's a quiet, persistent expectation that something will go wrong, that the connection will shift, that the emotional ground will become unstable again. So what do? They become highly attuned, but also highly guarded. They listen closely, but they don't reveal much. They understand deeply, but they don't easily let themselves be understood. They can explain your emotions better than you can, but struggle to safely express their own. And over time, this creates distance, not the obvious kind, not the kind where someone is cold or detached on the surface. In fact, trauma-born empaths often appear warm, engaging, even charismatic. They know how to make people feel seen. They know how to create connection. But internally, there's a boundary that most people never cross, because from their perspective, emotional closeness has never been neutral. It's always carried weight. It's always required vigilance. And eventually it becomes exhausting to maintain that level of awareness while also trying to stay open. So something starts to shift. They begin to realize that constantly monitoring other people comes at the cost of losing themselves. That being the one who always understands means rarely being understood. That being emotionally available to everyone often leads to being emotionally depleted. And once that awareness sets in, it changes how they relate to people entirely. They start asking different questions, not how can I help this person feel better, but what is this interaction costing me? Not how do I maintain this connection, but is this connection stable enough to trust? That's a major psychological pivot, because now empathy is no longer automatic, it's selective. And this is where the distance becomes more visible. They stop engaging at the same level. They stop offering unlimited access. They stop assuming that connection is inherently good. Instead, they evaluate it quietly, internally, constantly. And to someone on the outside, this can feel confusing because the empath hasn't lost their ability to connect. They've just stopped doing it without discretion. They've learned that not every emotional signal deserves a response, that not every relationship deserves depth. And most importantly, they've learned that understanding someone doesn't obligate them to stay connected to them. This is the beginning of emotional distance, not as a defense mechanism in the traditional sense, but as a form of regulation, a way to preserve energy, a way to avoid repeating patterns that were established early on. But here's the deeper layer. Even as they create this distance, the original wiring doesn't disappear. They still notice everything. They still feel deeply. They still pick up on emotional undercurrents that others miss. The difference is that they no longer act on it the same way. There's restraint now. There's observation without immediate involvement. There's awareness without automatic empathy-driven action. And that can make them seem harder to reach because you're no longer interacting with someone who responds instinctively. You're interacting with someone who filters everything first. And that filter was built through experience. Experience that taught them that not all connections are safe, that emotional access should be earned, not assumed. That depth without stability leads to damage. So the trauma-born empath doesn't lose their ability to connect. They refine it. They move from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy, from reactive understanding to intentional engagement. And in doing so, they create a kind of distance that isn't about pushing people away, it's about choosing carefully who gets close. Because when empathy is built through trauma, connection is never casual. It's calculated, it's measured, and above all, it's protected. And the realization that changes everything is this: just because you can. Understand everyone doesn't mean everyone deserves access to you. If you follow this pattern far enough, you start to notice a turning point that is subtle at first, but decisive once it fully takes hold. It's the moment the empath stops giving in the way they always have. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, but quietly. Almost imperceptibly, the same person who once leaned in, who once absorbed, who once made space for everyone else, begins to pull back. And this shift doesn't come from a single event. It's cumulative. It's the result of repeated emotional investments that weren't reciprocated. Conversations where they listened deeply but were never truly heard. Relationships where they showed up consistently but were only valued for what they provided, not for who they were. Over time, this creates a pattern the mind can no longer ignore. Because at a certain point, even the most patient person starts to recognize imbalance. And once that recognition becomes conscious, behavior begins to change. What's important to understand here is that the empath doesn't suddenly become indifferent. That's a common misconception. They don't wake up one day and decide they no longer care. In fact, the capacity to care is still very much intact. If anything, it's sharper than ever. But what changes is their willingness to act on it without evaluation. Before this shift, empathy is almost reflexive. Someone expresses distress, and the empath moves toward it. They engage, they support. They try to stabilize. It feels natural, almost automatic. But after enough experiences where that effort leads to depletion rather than connection, the brain starts to interrupt that reflex. It inserts a pause, and that pause is everything. Because in that space, a different question emerges. Not what does this person need from me, but what is this going to cost me? And that question begins to reshape behavior in a very real way. They start conserving energy. They listen, but they don't absorb as deeply. They respond, but they don't overextend. They care, but they don't carry. And from the outside, this can look like withdrawal. People who are used to the old version of the empath may interpret this as distance, coldness, or even rejection. They might say, "You've changed," without realizing that what they're actually noticing is the absence of overextension they once benefited from. Because when someone has always had unlimited access to you, any boundary feels like a loss. But for the empath, it feels like relief. For the first time, they're not constantly scanning the emotional environment. They're not taking responsibility for regulating other people's states. They're not trying to anticipate and fix everything before it escalates. They're allowing things to exist without immediate intervention. And that's a significant psychological shift because it requires tolerating discomfort, the discomfort of not stepping in, not solving, not rescuing. It means watching. Situations unfold without inserting themselves as the stabilizing force. And initially, that can feel unnatural. There's often guilt attached to it, a sense that they're not doing what they're supposed to do, that they're letting people down, that they're becoming less of who they've always been. But over time, that guilt starts to dissolve as a new pattern emerges. They begin to notice that not every situation collapses without their involvement, that not every emotional signal requires a response, that people are, in many cases, capable of managing their own internal states without constant external support. And more importantly, they begin to notice the effect this has on their own internal state. There's more clarity, more stability, more energy. They're no longer operating in a constant state of emotional expenditure. And that creates space to think, to reflect, to reconnect with parts of themselves that were previously overshadowed by the needs of others. This is where the withdrawal becomes intentional. It's no longer just a reaction to exhaustion, it's a strategy. They start choosing when to engage and when to step back. They become more selective about the conversations they enter, the relationships they invest in, the emotional dynamics they participate in. And that selectivity changes how they're perceived, because now access to them is limited, not in a rigid or defensive way, but in a deliberate, measured way. They're no longer available on demand. They're no longer the default source of emotional support for everyone around them. And for some people, that shift is uncomfortable because it removes a dynamic they relied on. But for the empath, it's necessary because what they've come to understand is that constant availability leads to constant depletion. That being everything for everyone eventually leaves them with nothing for themselves. So they begin to recalibrate. They invest where there's mutuality. They engage where there's stability. They open up where there's trust. And everywhere else they maintain distance. Not out of resentment, but out of awareness. They've learned through experience that empathy without boundaries isn't connection, it's consumption. And once you see that clearly, you can't go back to operating the same way. So the withdrawal continues quietly, consistently, without the need for explanation, and what replaces it is something far more sustainable, a form of engagement that is intentional. Rather than automatic, a presence that is offered, not assumed, a connection that is built, not given away. And that's the real shift. The empath doesn't stop caring. They stop sacrificing themselves in the process of caring. And once that line is drawn, everything changes. Because the moment you stop giving from obligation and start choosing where your energy goes, you stop being emotionally available to everyone and start being emotionally aligned with yourself. If you continue observing this pattern as it evolves, you reach a stage that from the outside is often misunderstood. It looks like isolation. It looks like disconnection. It even gets labeled as loneliness. But internally, the experience is very different because what appears to be loss begins to feel like relief. This is where the empath, after pulling back and recalibrating their energy, starts to confront a realization that reshapes everything. Not all absence is painful. In fact, some forms of absence are stabilizing. For most people, the idea of having no close circle, no constant stream of interaction, triggers a sense of deficiency. There's an assumption that connection in any form is better than none. That being alone is inherently negative. But the trauma-born empath doesn't process it that way anymore because their past experiences have already challenged that assumption. They've lived through connections that were draining. They've experienced relationships that required constant emotional labor without reciprocity. They've been in environments where being around others meant being on alert, managing dynamics, or suppressing parts of themselves to maintain stability. So when those dynamics are no longer present, the absence of them doesn't register as emptiness, it registers as quiet. And that quiet has value. It's the first time they're not adjusting themselves to fit someone else's emotional state. It's the first time they're not anticipating reactions, not calculating. Response is not filtering their behavior to maintain a connection. There's no pressure to perform empathy, no expectation to be the stabilizer, no need to carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to them. And in that space, something shifts internally. Their baseline changes. What once felt normal, constant engagement, continuous emotional exchange now feels intrusive. Not because interaction itself is negative, but because they've experienced the contrast. They've seen what it feels like to exist without that constant input, and it recalibrates their sense of what's necessary. So the absence of friends, or at least the absence of frequent emotionally demanding relationships, stops feeling like something to fix. It becomes something to protect. This is where the paradox becomes clear. Externally, it may look like they've lost something. Internally, they feel like they've gained control. Control over their time, their energy, their emotional environment. And once that control is established, the idea of reintroducing chaotic or unbalanced connections becomes far less appealing. Because now, they're not seeking connection out of habit or expectation. They're evaluating it. They're asking, does this add stability or does it disrupt it? Does this deepen my clarity or does it fragment it? Is this connection aligned with who I am now, or does it pull me back into patterns I've already outgrown? And those questions don't always lead to more people. In fact, more often than not, they lead to fewer. This is why the empath can exist in what others would call loneliness without experiencing it as suffering. Because loneliness, in its most painful form, comes from disconnection combined with desire, the feeling of wanting meaningful connection and not having it. But here, the desire itself has changed. It's no longer about quantity. It's not even about constant presence. It's about quality, alignment, and emotional safety. And if those conditions aren't met, the absence of connection doesn't create distress, it reinforces clarity. This doesn't mean they've become antisocial or incapable of forming relationships. It means their threshold has shifted. What they're willing to engage with has become more refined, more selective, more intentional. And that selectivity naturally reduces the number of people who fit into their world. Which brings us back to perception. From the outside, someone might say, "You're alone." From the inside, the response is, "I'm at peace." And that difference matters because it highlights a fundamental shift in how value is assigned. The empath is no longer measuring their life by external indicators, how many people they interact with, how often they're included, how socially active they appear. They're measuring it by internal stability, by how they feel in their own space, by how much clarity they have in their own thoughts, by how little emotional noise they're carrying on behalf of others. And once that becomes the metric, everything else reorganizes around it. They become comfortable with silence. Not just external silence, but internal silence, the absence of constant emotional processing tied to other people. They begin to appreciate solitude not as a fallback, but as a preferred state when it offers more consistency than most interactions. And here's where it becomes especially important to understand the distinction. This isn't avoidance, it's discernment. Avoidance is driven by fear of being hurt, rejected, or overwhelmed. Discernment is driven by awareness of patterns, consequences, and personal limits. The empath at this stage isn't hiding from connection. They're choosing it carefully, based on a deeper understanding of what it actually requires. And until that standard is met, they remain where they are. Not stuck, not lost, not incomplete, just selective. And that selectivity is what transforms loneliness into peace. Because when you remove the expectation that you should always be connected, you create the possibility that being alone can be enough. Not permanently, not in every context, but in a way that is stable, intentional, and self-sustaining. And that's a level of independence most people never fully reach. Because it requires letting go of the idea that connection is automatically valuable. It requires recognizing that the wrong connections can cost more than they give. And it requires trusting that the absence of something doesn't always mean something is missing. Sometimes it means something is finally right. And once you experience that kind of peace, even briefly, you stop chasing noise just to avoid silence. You start protecting the silence instead, because you understand at a deeper level that peace is not the absence of people. It's the absence of what drains you. By the time you reach this stage, there's a final misunderstanding that needs to be addressed, because from the outside, the transformation can look like something. It's not. When someone becomes harder to reach, more selective, less emotionally available, the immediate assumption is that they've become cold, detached, maybe even indifferent. But that assumption misses what's actually happening beneath the surface, because the depth never disappeared. If anything, it became more concentrated. The trauma-born empath doesn't lose their emotional capacity. They don't suddenly stop feeling, stop noticing, stop understanding. All of those mechanisms are still active, often at a level that exceeds the people around them. They still pick up on tone shifts, subtle inconsistencies, emotional undercurrents that most would overlook. The difference is that they no longer offer access to that depth automatically. And that distinction is critical. Before this transformation, their internal world was highly accessible. If someone needed understanding, they provided it. If someone expressed emotion, they met it. If someone sought connection, they opened the door, often without asking whether that person had the awareness, stability, or intention to handle what they were being given. But experience changes that, because when you repeatedly expose your depth to people who don't recognize it, don't respect it, or don't reciprocate it, you start to realize that openness without discernment isn't generosity, it's vulnerability without structure. So the empath adapts. They don't shut down their emotional range. They regulate access to it. And that regulation creates the impression of distance. Now, when someone interacts with them, they're not immediately met with the full extent of their emotional intelligence. There's a layer in between, a kind of filter that evaluates before it engages. Not in a suspicious or paranoid way, but in a measured, deliberate way. They observe first. They assess patterns, how consistent someone is, how they handle boundaries, how they respond to small amounts of vulnerability before being trusted with more. They pay attention to whether words align with behavior, whether presence is stable or conditional, whether engagement feels mutual or extractive. And based on that observation, they decide how much of themselves to reveal. For many people, this feels unfamiliar because they're used to more immediate forms of connection. They're used to emotional access being granted quickly, sometimes even freely. So when they encounter someone who doesn't operate that way, it can feel like resistance, like there's a barrier. But what they're actually encountering is structure. The empath has moved from being open by default to being open by decision. And that decision is based on something very specific. Trust earned through consistency. Until that consistency is established, the empath remains composed, present, even engaged, but not fully exposed. There's a difference between participating in an interaction and investing in it, and they've learned to separate the two. This is why they can appear calm in situations that would have previously pulled them in emotionally. It's not that they're unaffected, it's that they're no longer allowing every external stimulus to dictate their internal state. There's a boundary now, an internal line that distinguishes between what they notice and what they absorb. And that line is what preserves their stability, because without it, they would revert to the same patterns: overanalyzing, overgiving, overextending. Patterns that once felt natural, but ultimately led to depletion. So they maintain that boundary even when it's misunderstood, even when others interpret it as disinterest, even when it means fewer connections, because they've already experienced what happens when that boundary doesn't exist, and they're not willing to repeat it. Now here's where the deeper philosophical shift takes place. The empath begins to understand that emotional depth is not something to distribute equally. It's not a resource that should be made universally available. It's something that carries weight, that has impact, that requires responsibility both from the person offering it and the person receiving it. And once you see it that way, your entire approach to connection changes. You stop asking, how can I be more open? And you start asking, who has demonstrated the capacity to meet me at that level? Because depth without alignment creates imbalance. An imbalance over time leads to damage. So the empath becomes selective, not out of superiority, not out of judgment, but out of clarity. They recognize that not everyone is equipped for the kind of connection they're capable of offering. And instead of lowering that standard, they maintain it, which naturally reduces access. But it also increases the quality of the connections that do form. Because when someone does reach that level, when they show consistency, respect boundaries, engage with awareness, the empath responds fully. There's no hesitation at that point. Number, withholding. The depth is still there, intact and available. It's just no longer given without evidence that it will be received properly. And that's the key distinction. Emotionally unreachable doesn't mean emotionally unavailable. It means emotionally intentional. It means that access is no longer based on proximity, frequency, or demand. It's based on alignment, trust, and demonstrated understanding. And that's a higher standard than most people are used to. But it's also a necessary one. Because without it, the empath would continue operating in a way that prioritizes others at the expense of themselves, and that's no longer an option. So they hold the line, quietly, consistently, without needing validation for it. And over time, that line becomes part of who they are, not as a defense, but as a form of self-respect, because they've learned that protecting their depth is the only way to preserve it. And the realization that anchors this entire transformation is simple, but not easy to accept. Your ability to feel deeply is not the problem. Your willingness to give that depth to the wrong people is. And the moment you learn to tell the difference is the moment your emotional world becomes yours again.